Loras Tyrell was not born with a sword in his hand, but in Highgarden, people swore it had bloomed in his cradle. From the moment he could walk, he watched the knights of the Reach train under the golden sun, their armor shining, their swords dancing in the air like steel petals in the wind. But unlike many highborn boys, Loras didn't just admire them, he wanted to be better than them. His father, Mace Tyrell, often boasted about their family's influence and wealth. But Loras didn't care much for feasts or the empty pride of titles. It was his mother, Lady Allery, who saw the fire in him. "Your beauty might win hearts," she once told him, "but if you want to protect anything you love, you must be more than a pretty face." And so began his journey. At just 9 years old, Loras started training under Ser Brynden Flowers, a bastard knight known more for his scars than his titles. Ser Brynden didn't go easy on the golden boy of Highgarden. "Strength without pain is just decoration," he told him one morning, after knocking him into the mud for the 3rd time. Loras didn't cry. He got up, clenched his teeth, and asked for another round. Within a few years, the difference in him became obvious. While other noble boys trained for status, Loras trained for survival. His sword was lighter than most, his movements more fluid, he didn't overpower his opponents, he outthought them. He turned his weaknesses into strengths. Being lean made him quick. Being young made him fearless. And being beautiful, well, that just made others underestimate him. Until it was too late. When he was 14, he entered his first tourney. People whispered he was too young, too delicate. But by the end of the day, their whispers turned into roars. He defeated knights twice his age, including Ser Emmon of Ashford, known for breaking 3 ribs with a single charge. Loras dodged his lance and sent him flying off his horse in front of the crowd. It wasn't just a win, it was a statement. "Who trained this boy?" someone in the crowd asked. "The gods," someone else muttered. But the gods had nothing to do with it. It was blood, sweat, broken bones, and the quiet rage of a boy who wanted to prove he wasn't just another noble rose. People began calling him the Knight of Flowers, at first with a hint of mockery. But soon, the name became something more, a symbol of elegance wrapped in steel, grace that could kill. Still, not everyone respected him. Behind his back, lords sneered at his appearance. Whispers of his closeness to Renly Baratheon made many call his knighthood into question. "Pretty boys don't win wars," one old bannerman muttered. But they weren't there in the duels. They didn't see how fast Loras moved, how calm his eyes stayed when blades swung for his throat. They didn't see how his blade didn't tremble, not even once. And Loras? He didn't care what they said. The battlefield didn't care who you kissed. Steel didn't ask questions. Either you survived, or you bled. The real turning point came at Bitterbridge. He was just 16 when the banners of House Tyrell joined Renly Baratheon's claim for the Iron Throne. Many expected the boy knight to remain in the background, waving flags and making speeches. But instead, he was on the front lines, sword drawn, roses painted on his shield. When the enemy came charging, Loras didn't hesitate. He led the countercharge himself, cutting down armored men like wheat. Ser Willis Fell, a seasoned knight, later said, "I saw death in his eyes." Not for himself, but for anyone who threatened the man he loved, or the house he served. That night, covered in blood and sweat, Loras didn't celebrate. He just sat by the river, sharpening his blade. "Why do you keep fighting so hard?" a fellow knight asked him. Loras looked at the water, his reflection rippling in the moonlight. "Because I'm not allowed to fail," he said softly. "Not in this world." And he meant it. He was never allowed to fail. That thought stayed with Loras like a second heartbeat, pulsing in every duel, every charge, every silent night when he sat with his sword instead of sleeping. In a realm ruled by power, and a court ruled by whispers, being a beautiful boy who loved another man wasn't just dangerous, it was deadly. He couldn't afford mistakes. Not one. After Bitter Bridge, Loras' name began to echo across Westeros not as a showpiece knight, but as a legitimate force. Lords who once dismissed him now watched his movements with caution. He was no longer just Renly's favorite, he was the youngest warrior to defeat seasoned knights on equal footing. But with fame came pressure, and with pressure came enemies. Renly's camp was growing. The Reach had thousands of men, and with House Tyrell's support, Renly's claim to the Iron Throne looked unstoppable. Loras stayed by Renly's side, loyal not just to the crown, but to the man beneath it. To him, Renly was more than a king, he was hope. A world where he could be loved openly, where his skills were respected, and his name not ridiculed. That vision kept Loras sharp. But not everyone shared that dream. When Stannis' shadow struck, that cursed, inhuman thing that slid into Renly's tent and took his life, Loras lost more than his king. He lost purpose. They said he screamed, wept, and drew his sword on every man in the room, convinced someone had betrayed them. They had to hold him back as he tried to break into Stannis' camp alone, fueled by rage and heartbreak. Ser Robar Royce and Ser Emon Cui, once sworn brothers, were cut down in the confusion. Some whispered Loras killed them in his madness. He never denied it. But even in grief, he didn't fall apart. He turned that fury inward, into discipline, into obsession. In the months that followed, his training became more brutal. He practiced until his hands blistered and bled. He didn't speak much. His eyes, once bright with charm and youth, became colder. Loras had changed. Not weaker, sharper. Like a blade tempered by fire. When the Tyrells made their alliance with House Lannister, it was a political move. But for Loras, it was personal revenge. Marrying Margaery to Joffrey meant bringing the Reach to King's Landing. It meant power. And Loras needed power to make those who destroyed Renly pay. But the capital was no battlefield. It was worse, a city of liars, spiders, and serpents. And in that pit of poison, Loras stood out. At Joffrey's wedding, when the boy king mocked him in front of the court, Loras didn't flinch. He kept smiling. But later, in the yard, he shattered a practice dummy's helmet with one swing and didn't stop until his blade broke. Jaime Lannister once said, Loras fights like a man trying to prove something every time he lifts a sword. And he was right. When Jaime himself returned from the Riverlands, one-handed and bitter, it was Loras who dared to face him. Not out of disrespect, but to test the man everyone once called the best swordsman in the realm. You're still dangerous, even crippled, Loras said after sparring. Jaime only smirked. And you fight like someone with nothing left to lose. That was the truth. Loras didn't just fight to win, he fought because it was the only thing he had left that made sense. In a world where his love was forbidden, where the man he loved was murdered by magic, where politics was filled with backstabbing and false smiles, the sword was honest. A blade didn't lie. His skills continued to impress even his enemies. During the siege of Dragonstone, Loras volunteered to lead the assault. Many thought it was madness, the fortress was nearly impenetrable. But Loras didn't wait. He charged up the beach himself, rallying his men through fire and arrows. He took 3 wounds and kept fighting. When the gates finally opened, they found him standing bloodied at the front, defiant, alive, and furious. Madness, one maester whispered. Courage, said another. But those who knew Loras best saw what it really was, guilt. Regret. Pain worn like armor. And still, he didn't rest. Even after Dragonstone, even after the maesters told him to stop fighting, that he needed time to heal, Loras trained. He swung his sword with bandaged hands, limped into the practice yard with bruised ribs, and bled onto the sand without flinching. Because failure wasn't allowed. Because being good wasn't enough. He had to be the best. There was something haunting about walking through King's Landing in armor. The way the people looked at knights, with hope, with fear, with suspicion. Loras Tyrell had learned to read those stares. Once, they'd looked at him like a hero. Now, they looked at him like a man walking too close to the edge. After Dragonstone, he was a legend to some, a fool to others. The story said he stormed the gate with fire all around him, 3 arrows in his body, still swinging. Some said he killed 20 men by himself. Others whispered that he'd lost his mind and didn't care if he lived or died. The truth, as always, was somewhere in between. Loras didn't care for glory. He cared for silence. For the sound of steel meeting steel. It was the only thing that made sense anymore. The court was poison. The throne room was a theater. The Red Keep, for all its power, reeked of false smiles. He didn't trust any of them. Not Cersei, not Littlefinger, not the old lords who bowed and whispered behind curtains. Even the King's Guard, once the most honorable order in the realm, felt like a lie. But Loras had taken the white cloak anyway. Not because he believed in the king, or even the crown. But because the cloak was still sacred to him. The oath. The discipline. The purity of purpose. A knight of the King's Guard was supposed to be beyond politics. Above betrayal. Of course, that was another lie. But it was a lie Loras chose to believe, because the truth was too bitter to swallow. Serving under King Tommen was a strange fate. Tommen was a child, kind-hearted, soft-spoken, and easily led. Loras treated him with respect, but never flattery. He wasn't there to play politics anymore. He showed up. He guarded. He trained. That was it. And when he wasn't serving, he was fighting, even if it was just against ghosts. The practice yard became his second home. Every morning, before the sun rose, he was already there, sweating, swinging, bleeding if he had to. Ser Balon Swan once told a squire, "If you want to see what obsession looks like, watch Ser Loras train. He doesn't stop because he's strong. He stops because his body gives out." But strength had its cost. His shoulder still ached from Dragonstone. One of his ribs never fully healed. His knuckles cracked when he flexed his fingers too hard. And yet, he didn't slow down. He couldn't. In private, Loras sometimes stared at his reflection in the polished metal of his armor. He looked the same, handsome, poised, perfect to those who didn't know better. But behind the eyes, he felt empty. Not broken, just hollowed out. Like the part of him that used to believe in something had been carved out and thrown away. He missed Renly every day. Not just the man, the version of himself that existed when Renly was alive. That young, hopeful knight who believed he could protect everything he loved. That version was dead too. Marjorie saw it. She was clever, sharper than anyone gave her credit for. One evening, in the garden, she told him, "You don't have to keep punishing yourself. You're not the only one who lost him." Loras didn't reply. He just looked at her with tired eyes and said, "I wasn't fast enough." Later that night, he dreamt of Renly's tent again. The candlelight. The warmth. The way Renly smiled, touched his hand, told him the future could be theirs. And then the shadow came. He always woke up before it struck, heart pounding like a war drum. Still, the world moved on. Cersei began her quiet war with the Faith. The High Sparrow rose, and the streets of King's Landing grew colder. What began as whispers turned into arrests. What started as sermons turned into punishments. And then, one morning, they came for Loras. It wasn't a battlefield. No swords. No warning. Just silence. He was praying alone, not to the seven, but to memories, when they entered. The Faith militant. Armed, cloaked in righteousness, they grabbed him without ceremony. He didn't resist. Not because he was afraid, but because he was tired. In the September of Baelor, chained and bloodied, he was no longer the Knight of Flowers. They asked him questions, about his lovers, about Renly, about sin. They spat the words with disgust, pretending it was about justice. Loras didn't beg. He didn't argue. He just sat there, wounded and proud. When the High Sparrow said, "Confess, and we will show mercy," Loras looked him in the eye and replied, "I've never asked for mercy." They tortured him anyway. They broke bones. Cut into his skin. Made him crawl like a criminal through the sacred halls. And yet, no matter how hard they pushed, they couldn't break the fighter in him. The sword was gone. His armor stripped. But Loras Tyrell, even on his knees, bleeding and mocked, still looked more noble than the hypocrites who tried to shame him. Because he had fought for love. He had fought for loyalty. And now, he was fighting for his soul. The September wasn't just a prison, it was a slow death. Not the kind with swords or fire, but the kind that crept into the bones, that hollowed you out from the inside. The silence there was heavy. It pressed on Loras' chest harder than any wound he'd ever taken. Time had no meaning in those stone walls. No sun, no sound of steel, no wind across the reach. Just chanting, footsteps, and the smell of blood and damp cloth. They didn't break him in one day. No, they were patient. At first, they tried to humiliate him. Took his name, his title, his dignity. He was no longer Ser Loras Tyrell, Knight of Flowers. He was the sinner. They called him unnatural. They shaved his head, stripped him naked, forced him to kneel and pray for hours until his knees split open. When he collapsed, they beat him with rods and dragged him to the altar to begin again. Still, he didn't scream. That was their goal, to make him scream. He stayed quiet. In his mind, he went back to Highgarden. To the rose gardens, the laughter of his sisters, the cold steel of practice swords, the smile of Renly behind a curtain of green and gold. He remembered the smell of citrus in the summer, the way Renly laughed with his whole body. He lived there in his head, while his body suffered in the dark. But memory can only shield a man for so long. One night, they came with blades again, not to kill, but to scar. They cut into the muscle of his thigh, slow and deep, praying over him while the blood soaked the stone floor. He clenched his teeth until they cracked. His hands shook, but he did not cry. He just whispered one word to himself, "Breathe." The High Sparrow came to him later, dressed in rags but speaking like a king. "You could be saved, Ser Loras. All you must do is repent. Admit your sins. Abandon your false pride." Loras looked up, blood crusted in his hair, eyes dull from days without rest. "I've sinned," he said hoarsely, "but not for who I loved." The old man didn't reply. He only turned and left, and that night they gave him no food. But Marjorie came. She wasn't allowed to speak freely, but she was clever. Even in a guarded room, she found ways to pass him strength. A gentle look. A slight nod. The way her fingers brushed his wrist and lingered just long enough to remind him he wasn't alone. "You don't have to do this, Loras," she whispered one day when no guards were close. "Just confess. Give them what they want. We'll fix everything once you're free." But he didn't answer. Because he knew. Once you confess for something that isn't wrong, you don't just betray yourself. You betray every silent voice who never got the chance to speak. He couldn't do that. Not even for her. So, the beatings got worse. He was too weak to stand by the third week. They had to carry him to the altar. His left hand wouldn't close anymore. He hadn't held a sword in months. The scar on his thigh burned with every breath. But still, they couldn't get him to kneel on his own. So, they broke his leg. The sound echoed through the September like a crack of thunder. Loras didn't scream, but his eyes rolled back, and the room swam with stars. They dragged him down and forced him to the floor. He couldn't feel anything after that. Not pain. Not hate. Just cold. He lay there for hours, unmoving. And in that moment, something changed. He knew he couldn't fight anymore, not with a sword, not with his hands. They had taken his strength. His speed. His pride. He could feel it slipping like sand through his fingers. So when the High Sparrow returned the next day, Loras didn't look away. He didn't spit or curse. He simply said, "What do you want from me?" The old man smiled like he'd won. "Repent. Become one of us. Let go of your vanity. Your sin. Your name. Let go of who you were." And Loras, broken, bleeding, barely breathing, whispered, "Fine." They called it surrender. But to Loras, it wasn't. It was survival. He wasn't giving them his soul. He was hiding it. He shaved his head. Took their robes. He walked behind them with bowed shoulders and a limp. He murmured prayers with dry lips and shut his eyes when they asked. But inside, he was still a fighter. He wasn't finished yet. They thought they had broken him. That was the most dangerous mistake anyone could make about Loras Tyrell. To look at him limping through the halls of the September, head shaved, face pale, robes plain and stained with dried blood, and assume that the night was gone. That the pride, the fire, the warrior had died in the darkness. But it hadn't died. It had gone quiet. Loras had learned something important in that stone prison: you didn't always need a sword to fight. You didn't always need to shout to resist. Sometimes, survival was a form of defiance. Every time they expected him to scream and he didn't, that was a victory. Every time they whispered about how long he'd last, and he kept walking, even if he was dragging one leg behind him, that was a battle won. His body was broken. But his will wasn't. And they knew it. The faith kept him close, thinking they had him under control. He'd confessed, after all. He had submitted. They used him as a symbol, the Golden Knight of House Tyrell, reduced to a humble servant of the Seven. But behind those humble robes, Loras was still watching, still listening. He noticed things. How certain septons moved when no one was looking. How the faith militant whispered to one another in corners. He saw the fear in their eyes when Queen Cersei was mentioned. He caught glimpses of old bloodstains on robes that had supposedly never seen violence. He may have been bent, but he was not blind. When Marjorie visited again, it had been weeks. Her expression was calm, but her eyes searched him like a sister who'd shared a childhood full of secrets. She sat across from him, with two septas nearby, and spoke in soft tones. "They say you're changed," she said, folding her hands. "Is that true?" Loras lowered his gaze, playing the part. "I'm only what the gods have made me." Marjorie smiled faintly. "They say pain is the best teacher." He nodded. "It teaches you what you can live without." Their eyes locked. That was enough. She understood. Loras hadn't given up. He had changed tactics. The next few days, he played his role better than ever. He prayed louder. Moved slower. Flinched when they expected him to. He let them think he was done, that his spirit had crumbled under the weight of guilt and sin. But deep inside, something sharper was forming, not just anger, but purpose. Because outside the September, the game was still going. Marjorie was under threat. His family's name was being dragged through filth. Cersei Lannister played her games with wildfire and secrets, and all the while, the faith wrapped itself tighter around the city's throat. Loras knew he couldn't stop them with a sword anymore. His body wouldn't allow it. But he could be the match that set everything ablaze. One evening, as he was helping clean the steps of the September, he collapsed. On purpose. They rushed to him, thinking his wounds had worsened. He was pale, shaking, muttering prayers. They brought water. A healer. The High Sparrow himself came to observe. That night, he was placed in a separate room. Quiet. Fewer guards. They thought he was too weak to move. But Loras didn't need to move fast. He just needed to endure long enough for the plan to fall into place. The explosion came at dawn. Wildfire roared through the September of Baelor with a scream that split the sky. The windows shattered before the green fire swallowed the walls. It was not a battle. It was annihilation. Every stone turned to ash. Every hymn turned to screams. And Loras was inside. He never had a chance to run. He didn't try. Some said he was kneeling when it happened. Others claimed he stood facing the altar, eyes open, daring the fire to come. No one knows for sure. But one thing was certain, he never begged. Not once. When the fire took him, the city lost a knight. The Reach lost a son. Marjorie lost a brother. But what really died in that fire was something far more dangerous, a man who chose dignity over survival, even when survival seemed like the only option left. In the days that followed, songs were sung in the Reach. Quiet ones. The kind only loyal hearts sang behind closed doors. They didn't call him the Knight of Flowers anymore. They called him the rose that wouldn't wilt. The ashes hadn't settled, and already the stories began. In King's Landing, they spoke in hushed voices of the fire that consumed the September of Baelor, of the green light that lit the sky like a second sun, of screams swallowed by flames. No bells rang. No priests mourned. There was no ceremony for the dead. Just silence and smoke. But in the Reach, where flowers once bloomed for him, Loras Tyrell's name was spoken with something far deeper than grief. It was reverence. News spread like a slow, burning wind across the fertile lands of House Tyrell. Highgarden flew its banners at half-mast. People lit candles in windows, tied white sashes on doors, and left single roses outside gates. No one told them to. They just did it. Because for all the world's lies about him, about who he loved, about how he fought, about why he died, the people knew one thing. Loras had never stopped fighting. He hadn't died a quiet death. He hadn't slipped away in his sleep. He had stood his ground, even when there was nothing left to stand on. And he had done it with no sword, no armor, no army. Just his pride. Just his silence. That's what stayed with them. At Highgarden, Lady Olenna Tyrell sat alone in the garden where Loras used to train as a boy. She watched the wind move through the roses, red, gold, white. Once, she'd laughed at his softness. Called him a pretty doll with a sword. But he had proved them all wrong. He fought until the end, she whispered to herself, a rare crack in her voice. Even when we couldn't help him. She didn't cry. Olenna Tyrell was not one for tears. But that night, when the servants passed her study, they found a white rose laid gently on her table. One of Loras' favorites. In Old Town, a young squire wrote down everything he had ever seen Ser Loras do in the training yard, every move, every duel, every lesson. He said he wanted to make a book. Not about the King's Guard. About the man behind the white cloak. It was the first time anyone had tried to write Loras Tyrell's story without filtering it through politics or scandal. The first time someone tried to show the boy beneath the title, the fighter beneath the elegance. But not everyone was mourning. In the capital, Queen Cersei Lannister sat on the Iron Throne, untouched by the fire she had unleashed. She never spoke of Loras again. She didn't need to. The silence was louder than any insult. She had wiped his name off the court records, off the King's Guard roll, off the history books. As if he'd never existed. But erasing a name doesn't erase a memory. And across Westeros, people still remembered. Some remembered how he once faced down a charging knight with nothing but a broken lance. Others remembered how he rode into battle at 16, fearless, not for glory but for love. Some remembered how he held Renly's banner long after his death, not because it was wise, but because it was right. And a few, the quiet few, remembered how he knelt in the September, broken but unbowed, refusing to give his shame to the men who had none. In the Stormlands, an old hedge knight who'd once fought in the tourneys spoke to a group of children by a fire. "They say he died with his head down," one of the boys said. The old knight shook his head. "No. He died standing, even if his legs didn't work anymore. That's the kind of fighter he was." "But he didn't win," a girl muttered. "No," the knight replied. "Not the way stories usually go. But sometimes, winning isn't about killing the dragon. It's about refusing to bow to it." That was Loras Tyrell's victory. Not in the arena. Not in battle. But in defiance. In being the man they didn't expect, strong when they called him soft, silent when they tried to shame him, unbroken even in ruin. His sword never swung again. His hands never held a rose again. But his name, the name they tried to erase, lived on. In whispers. In ballads. In the hearts of every fighter who ever felt alone, different, unworthy, and stood up anyway. Because of Loras Tyrell, they knew it could be done. Time has a strange way of reshaping the dead. In life, Loras Tyrell was praised, doubted, mocked, envied, and misunderstood. But in death, something shifted. His name, once tangled in court gossip and whispered rumors, began to echo in a different way, softer in tone, but heavier in meaning. His story began to travel, not by raven or royal decree, but by voice. Farmers spoke of him in taverns, knights told tales of his battles to squires eager to prove themselves. Bards rewrote songs that once ridiculed him, turning them into solemn ballads sung by candlelight. One song in particular grew in popularity. A soft, mournful tune called "The Broken Rose." He knelt not to gods nor crown, but to the pain he bore alone. A knight with no blade left to raise, still stood taller than any throne. No one knew who wrote it. Some said it was a maid from the Reach who once saw Loras give food to a starving child after a tourney. Others said it was one of the Silent Sisters who found a shred of his robe among the rubble of the September and wept over it for a whole day. Regardless of who penned the words, the song spread. And wherever it was sung, people didn't just hear a tragic end, they heard a legacy. In Dorne, where bastards wore their names with fire instead of shame, some respected Loras more in death than they did in life. A Dornish knight, Ser Kober, who had once crossed swords with Loras during a tourney in Sun Spear, told others, "He was faster than me. Smarter too. I only won because he slipped on sand. And still, after the match, he laughed and offered me wine." That's the kind of man he was. In the north, where the Tyrell name meant little and flowers had no place in war, stories still made their way past the frost. A young Manderley knight named Ser Jorah Snow carried a small white rose sewn into the inside of his cloak, not for love, but as a reminder. To stand when you've already lost, he told his companions. That's what makes a man worthy of armor. Even across the sea, in Essos, where Westerosi names were often forgotten, his tale found breath. In Bravos, a group of orphan boys who trained in secret, using wooden swords and bruised dreams, took to calling themselves the Blossoms. Not for beauty. For resistance. For pain that grows into strength. Because by now, Loras Tyrell wasn't just a knight. He was an idea. The warrior who fought in silence. The noble who didn't need a throne. The man who loved, lost, and still stood until the very end. And back in Westeros, far away from ballads and stories, his sister Marjorie still woke in the night expecting to hear his footsteps outside her chamber. She would turn, half asleep, expecting him to knock once, lean in, and say something dry and sarcastic like he used to. But there was only silence now. One afternoon, before the Tyrell name was erased entirely from court records, Marjorie visited the ruins of the September. It had been cleared of most debris. The air still carried a strange scent, ash, stone, and something faintly sweet, like burnt flowers. She knelt where the altar had once stood. There were no guards with her. No servants. Just her, and the memory of a brother whose laughter had once filled halls, whose blade had once sung in duels, and whose voice had gone quiet far too soon. She pulled something from her sleeve, a small, silver rose pin. Old, scratched, once worn by Loras at a feast when he was just a boy. He had dropped it that night, too busy trying to impress Renly with a dramatic story about defeating 3 men at once. Marjorie had kept it. She laid the pin on the broken stone and whispered, "You were never weak." She didn't cry. Her tears had dried months ago. What she felt now was older. Deeper. A kind of ache that became part of the bones. As she stood to leave, a septa nearby, one of the few still serving the 7, said gently, "He died confessing, didn't he?" "That's what they say." Marjorie paused. Then she turned, her voice quiet but sharp. "He died being more honest than anyone who ever judged him." And then she walked away, her head held high, the wind pulling at her green cloak like a banner. The world had changed. The Reach had lost its pride. The 7 kingdoms had lost a warrior. But somewhere, beneath all the ash and lies and noise, the truth of Loras Tyrell remained. He had been forged by love, scarred by loss, tempered by discipline, and in the end, he didn't just deserve his place among the elite. He redefined what it meant to be one of them. Years passed. The throne changed hands. Queens rose, kings fell, and war continued to shape the bones of Westeros like waves reshaping the shoreline. Castles crumbled, banners burned, alliances fractured and reformed again. The names of the powerful shifted, but the stories that truly lasted weren't the ones about who sat on the Iron Throne. They were about the ones who stood tall even when the world turned its back on them. And one such story, whispered more and more with each generation, was of Ser Loras Tyrell, the knight who chose silence over shame, defiance over surrender, and love over legacy. In the Citadel, where maesters once recorded only facts, birth dates, war statistics, noble lineages, a young novice named Maester Doran began collecting accounts of those who died during the September of Baelor's destruction. He was curious about truth, not propaganda. And the more he dug, the more he found that the name Loras Tyrell appeared again and again, always wrapped in conflict. To the court, he had been a pawn. To the faith, a symbol of sin. To the enemy, a pretty sword hand. But to the people who truly knew him, the squires, the knights, the servants who once dressed his armor, the orphans he'd given coin to, the men and women he'd saved on the battlefield, Loras was something else entirely. Not perfect. Not holy. But real. One squire, now grown and knighted, wrote a letter to Doran that read. "He once told me, a rose with thorns doesn't ask permission to grow." That's who he was. Beautiful, yes, but sharp. You couldn't box him into your version of what a knight should be. He was better than that. He was his own kind of fighter. Doran included the quote in a collection called Voices Beneath the Crown. It was the first time in official records that Loras Tyrell's sexuality, suffering, and sacrifice were mentioned without shame, not footnotes, but features. Meanwhile, in the Reach, the people had already moved past needing permission to remember him. A statue was raised, not by the lords, but by the people. Blacksmiths, traders, servants, and hedge knights pooled gold over the years, quietly and patiently. It wasn't grand or covered in jewels. It wasn't even inside a keep. It stood in an open field near Bitterbridge, where he had once led a charge as a boy not yet 17. The statue showed Loras standing tall, one leg slightly bent as if mid-movement. His face wasn't stern or smiling, just calm. His sword was lowered at his side, not raised in threat. A single rose was carved into the stone above his heart. Beneath it, in High Valyrian and the common tongue, were just 5 words. He bent, but never broke. It became a place of quiet pilgrimage. Not grand ceremonies, no parades. Just small moments. Knights placing their blades before it in silence before battles. Lovers holding hands and pressing roses into the grass. Broken men and women standing there at dusk, drawing strength from someone who'd faced the weight of the world and still held his head high. Years later, Queen Brienne of Tarth, the last true knight in a realm overrun with politics and shadows, visited the statue herself. She stood alone at sunset, cloak blowing behind her, sword at her hip. She placed her hand on the stone shoulder and whispered, "You were one of the few who made it matter." And that was perhaps the greatest truth about Loras Tyrell. He didn't fight just for house or title. He didn't raise his blade for songs or gold or even revenge in the end. He fought because he believed that being good wasn't enough, you had to stand for something, even if it meant falling. He proved that a fighter wasn't defined by the wars they won, but by the battles they chose to fight when no one was watching. And though history tried to forget him, and power tried to erase him, his legacy lived on in the places that couldn't be burned, the quiet hearts of those who saw strength in softness, courage in vulnerability, and honor in truth. Loras Tyrell died without glory. But he lived with purpose. And in the end, that's why he stood among the best.